How do you control a continent filled with millions of people, hundreds of languages, and ancient civilizations when you're just a few thousand foreign soldiers? You divide them. Europe didn't conquer Africa by brute force alone. They used something far more dangerous: manipulation. They drew fake borders, created fake ethnic rivalries, weaponized religion, and taught Africans to fear each other more than they feared their colonizers. The result: civil wars, genocides, broken nations, and a legacy of distrust that still haunts Africa today. This is not just a story about the past, it explains the present. And if you watch till the end, you'll understand how the colonial strategy of divide and rule continues to shape politics, conflicts, and identities across the continent to this day. So stay with us, because the truth that was hidden for generations is finally being told. When European empires took control of Africa, they knew they would always be a numerical minority in a foreign land. Ruling through force alone was costly, unsustainable, and risky. So instead of confronting united resistance, they developed a strategy that would weaken Africa from within, a strategy that didn't require tanks or constant warfare. They used divide and rule. This approach wasn't accidental. It was a calculated imperial policy, taught in colonial handbooks, shared in diplomatic dispatches, and debated in European parliaments. The goal? To turn Africans against each other, ensuring that no unified front could rise to challenge European authority. Colonial powers, especially Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany, began by classifying Africans into rigid ethnic, tribal, and religious categories, often for the first time in history. In many African societies, identity had been fluid and relational. People defined themselves by language, clan, region, or shared customs, not fixed tribes as Europeans imagined. But the colonial administrators froze these identities into administrative labels. They conducted ethnographic surveys, produced tribal maps, and created census categories that were often arbitrary or invented. A group that had long intermarried and lived in peace could be split into different tribes. Others who had no historical conflict were suddenly governed by colonial laws that put one group in power over another. Colonial legal codes and tax structures were then built around these divisions. The result? A society where privilege and punishment were assigned based on ethnic identity, not merit or contribution. In British colonies, this was implemented through a system called indirect rule. Instead of dismantling local power structures, the British co-opted them. But they didn't choose leaders based on legitimacy or tradition. They picked those who were loyal to the British. These chosen chiefs were often from one favored ethnic group, which gave them authority over rival groups. For example, in northern Nigeria, the British ruled through Hausa Fulani Muslim elites, allowing them to collect taxes and administer justice under Sharia law, while ignoring or suppressing the traditional systems of minority groups. In Uganda, the Baganda people were elevated over others, given control over regions that weren't traditionally theirs, causing deep resentment. In French colonies, the policy was different but equally divisive. The French pushed for assimilation, rewarding those who adopted French culture, language, and values with elite status. They created a small group of évolués, Africans who were considered civilized and were allowed access to schools, jobs, and political influence. This created internal class divisions between the French-favored elite and the rest of the population. Meanwhile, Belgium and Rwanda and Congo took it further, racializing class and ethnic differences with pseudoscience, issuing identity cards, and elevating one group over another purely to create tension and dependence on colonial power. By design, colonizers structured African societies to compete rather than cooperate, to distrust rather than unify. Because unity meant resistance. Division meant control. This strategy worked. Even when Africans tried to fight back, they were fractured, politically, socially, and culturally, by the artificial identities and unequal systems imposed upon them. And when independence came, these divisions did not simply disappear. They remained, embedded in the new states, political systems, and borders left behind by Europe. In 1884–85, a group of European men gathered in Berlin, not to discuss their own nations, but to redraw the map of a continent that none of them truly understood. This gathering, known as the Berlin Conference, was chaired by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and included representatives from 14 European nations, including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. No African leaders were invited. No African voices were heard. The conference was a formal meeting to divide Africa like a piece of real estate, without any concern for the people who lived there. Before the Berlin Conference, Europeans controlled only about 10% of Africa's land, mostly coastal trading ports. But by the end of it, they had laid the groundwork for the total colonization of over 90% of the continent within just a few decades. They called it the scramble for Africa, but it was less a scramble and more a cold, bureaucratic partition. The decisions made in Berlin resulted in some of the most damaging and irrational borders in modern history. Ethnic groups were split across multiple countries. For example, the Somali people were divided between British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, now Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya, a division that still causes political unrest and border disputes to this day. Rival communities were forced into a single state, setting the stage for civil wars and ethnic cleansing. In Nigeria, over 250 ethnic groups, including the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo, were grouped under one administration with vastly different languages, religions, and political systems. Traditional kingdoms and trade routes were destroyed. The Ashanti Kingdom, which had its own established political and economic systems, was absorbed into British-controlled Gold Coast, now Ghana, reducing a once sovereign state to a mere province under colonial rule. Geographic features like rivers, lakes, and mountains were ignored, replaced with straight-line borders that cut across entire ecosystems and civilizations, as if drawn with a ruler by people who had never set foot on the continent. This created over 40 new African colonies, most with no historical legitimacy. These borders were not designed for stability, prosperity, or unity. They were designed for European convenience, to maximize resource extraction and reduce conflicts between colonizers, not among the people being colonized. In Sudan, Arab Muslim elites in the north were favored by the British, while the Christian and animist populations in the south were marginalized. This imbalance led to decades of conflict and the eventual secession of South Sudan in 2011. In Rwanda and Burundi, Belgian-imposed ethnic hierarchies between the Tutsi and Hutu were compounded by arbitrary borders that made political cooperation almost impossible. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 200 ethnic groups were squeezed into a single, massive colony governed with brutality and neglect by Belgium, a decision that would lead to multiple civil wars and continued instability decades after independence. These European-imposed borders continue to haunt the continent today. Many of Africa's deadliest post-independence conflicts, from Biafra to Darfur, from Somalia to Rwanda, can be directly traced back to the chaotic, careless map drawn in Berlin. But these borders were never intended to serve Africans. They were drawn to divide, conquer, and extract. And they were one of the most effective tools of European domination, because a people divided by imaginary lines, unfamiliar languages, and forced political unions were far easier to control than a united continent. Perhaps no example better illustrates the devastating impact of colonial divide and rule than Rwanda. Before the arrival of European colonizers, Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda lived under a shared monarchy, spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda, practiced similar cultures, and even intermarried frequently. Social mobility existed. A Hutu could become a Tutsi through the acquisition of wealth or cattle, and vice versa. These were fluid class-like divisions, not rigid ethnic identities. That changed when the German colonizers, and later the Belgians, took control. The Belgians, after assuming power post-World War I under a League of Nations mandate, were heavily influenced by the racial pseudoscience of the time. They believed in the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, a racist European theory that claimed Tutsis were descendants of a superior, more Caucasian race that had migrated from the Middle East or North Africa. Using this unscientific theory, Belgian colonial officials classified the Tutsis as racially superior, smarter, and more suited for leadership, while labeling the Hutus as inferior, unintelligent, and fit only for manual labor. To institutionalize this artificial hierarchy, the Belgians introduced identity cards in 1933, marking every Rwandan as either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. gave Tutsis access to colonial education, administrative roles, and the church, ensured that Hutus were systematically excluded from political power and authority. This deliberate racial stratification was a classic divide-and-rule tactic. Elevate a minority, use them to control the majority, and keep both dependent on the colonial state. Over time, resentment grew. While some Tutsis genuinely held power and influence, many were seen by Hutus as collaborators with a brutal and foreign regime. The Belgians planted deep-seated mistrust between groups that had once lived in relative harmony. In the late 1950s, as African independence movements gained momentum, Belgium abruptly reversed its favoritism and began supporting the Hutu majority, anticipating that a democratic process would empower them. This sudden reversal triggered violence, as retaliatory killings and mass displacement of Tutsis began even before independence in 1962. But the seeds had already been sown. In 1994, after decades of political tension, civil war, and repeated outbreaks of violence, the Rwandan genocide erupted, following the assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana. Over the course of 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred by extremist Hutu militias. Neighbors killed neighbors, families were torn apart, entire communities were erased. What had once been a fluid and complex social structure was violently racialized, and it all began with Belgian colonial manipulation. Today, Rwanda is still healing from the trauma. The government has banned ethnic labels and rebuilt its society with a focus on unity. But the legacy of colonial engineering remains one of the most painful reminders of what divide and rule really meant. Not just political control, but calculated destruction of social cohesion that led to genocide. This wasn't an isolated case. Similar patterns of colonizers creating or weaponizing ethnic divisions can be seen across Africa. But Rwanda remains one of the clearest and bloodiest examples of the consequences when external powers use identity as a tool of control. Religion in Africa, prior to colonization, was diverse, overlapping, and often peacefully coexisting. In many regions, Islam, Christianity, and traditional African spiritual systems had existed side by side for centuries. But the European colonizers saw religion not as a cultural identity to be respected, but as another tool to divide and control. In regions where religious identities were already forming, the colonizers exaggerated and hardened them, while in other places, they deliberately introduced sectarian distinctions that had never existed. One of the clearest examples of religious divide as policy is Sudan. Under the Anglo-Egyptian administration, 1899 to 1956, the British governed the Muslim Arab North and Christian animist South as two separate entities. They imposed different education systems, languages, and legal codes in each region. Missionaries were restricted to the south, while Arabic and Islamic law dominated the north. Trade and travel between the two regions were discouraged, and even government officials were not transferred across the divide. By the time Sudan gained independence in 1956, the country was already deeply fractured, with two populations who had barely interacted for decades. The result? Two long, bloody civil wars, 1955 to 1972 and 1983 to 2005, that ultimately led to the secession of South Sudan in 2011. But even after independence, conflict continues, because the lines drawn by colonizers weren't just borders on a map, but psychological and cultural walls that reshaped how people saw one another. In Nigeria, the British colonial administration deepened divisions between the Muslim Hausa Fulani North, the Christian Igbo East, and the largely Christian Yoruba Southwest. British colonial officers governed the North through Islamic leaders, allowing Sharia law to persist while blocking Christian missionaries and Western education. In contrast, the South saw heavy missionary activity, widespread adoption of English education, and closer economic ties to the colonial government. By independence in 1960, the North lagged behind in literacy, education, and political organization, while the South was more urbanized and economically integrated. These imbalances bred resentment, suspicion, and political instability. Post-independence, these colonial-era religious divisions have continued to shape Nigerian politics, culminating in the Biafran Civil War, ongoing sectarian violence, and the rise of extremist groups like Boko Haram, which capitalized on the marginalization of northern Muslims. European colonizers may have physically left Africa in the 20th century, but the damage from their divide and rule strategy still remains embedded in the continent's borders, governance, and national identities. Colonialism deliberately created mistrust between communities. By favoring one ethnic group over another, or elevating one religion while suppressing another, colonizers ensured that African people would be more suspicious of each other than of the colonial state. Even after independence, many African countries struggled to build a shared national identity. Political parties were often formed along ethnic or regional lines, leading to fragile coalition governments, coups d'état, and civil wars. Enduring conflicts that still destabilize nations like Ethiopia, Cameroon, Central African Republic, and DR Congo. The legacy of colonial borders and manipulated identities has triggered some of Africa's deadliest post-independence conflicts. Rwanda, 1994, nearly 1 million dead in a genocide rooted in colonial ethnic classification. Biafra War, 1967 to 1970, in Nigeria, over 1 million people died due to famine and fighting. Darfur crisis in Sudan, fueled by Arab-African divisions exacerbated by colonial governance structures. Countries struggling with internal divisions find it harder to build stable governments, attract sustainable foreign investment, and maintain security without international aid or peacekeeping forces. This keeps many nations trapped in cycles of poverty, corruption, and instability, a situation that still benefits former colonial powers and multinational corporations. Another powerful method the colonial empires used to divide Africans was through their recruitment and deployment in labor and military forces. Colonizers knew that military loyalty and labor compliance were essential to suppress uprisings and extract resources, but they didn't trust a united African force, so they engineered division even within the ranks. Colonial powers recruited soldiers based not on national identity, but on ethnicity, region, and perceived physical traits. The British recruited Hausa soldiers in Nigeria, Nubians in Sudan, and Gurkhas from South Asia, claiming they were more martial and loyal. The French created the tirailleurs sénégalais, West African infantry units drawn mostly from Senegal, Mali, and Guinea, and sent them to fight in World Wars I and II. In East Africa, the British conscripted Maasai, Nandi, and other ethnic groups while excluding others deemed less cooperative. This structure prevented soldiers from identifying with their colony or with fellow Africans. Instead, they were taught to be loyal to their ethnic regiment and their European commander. Labor systems, like the military, were designed to pit ethnic groups against each other. In mines and plantations, ethnic groups were segregated into labor camps. Supervisors were often chosen from rival groups, reinforcing division. Colonizers introduced ethnic-based wage differences, creating economic hierarchies that deepened resentment. This wasn't limited to rural or low-skilled labor. Even in urban settings, access to jobs, education, and housing was often restricted or prioritized based on ethnicity or region. The result was twofold. African unity was dismantled at the foundational level, within the very structures of the economy and military. After independence, many newly formed national armies and bureaucracies were inherited with these same divisions intact, contributing to military coups, factionalism, and civil unrest. Decades after the official end of colonial rule, the legacy of divide and rule still shapes Africa's political, social, and economic fabric. In many African nations, political parties continue to form along ethnic or regional lines because colonial structures prevented the emergence of strong national identities. In Kenya, elections are often influenced by ethnic blocs such as the Kikuyu, Luo, and Kalenjin, leading to post-election violence like the 2007-08 crisis. In Nigeria, the concept of zoning, rotating the presidency between the North and South, is a direct consequence of regional and religious imbalance caused by the British. Colonial borders remain largely unchanged, and many of Africa's modern conflicts stem from these boundaries. DR Congo continues to face instability due to over 200 ethnic groups confined within one state. In Cameroon, tensions between Anglophone and Francophone populations, a colonial legacy, have sparked ongoing rebellion and repression. Somaliland, despite functioning independently, is not internationally recognized because it doesn't fit the colonial border map. Even at the grassroots level, Colonial-era divisions have made nation-building a fragile process. Religious extremism has flourished in regions neglected or marginalized by colonial governments. Tribalism, often a colonial construct, is now blamed for national disunity, even though its modern form was manufactured by colonial classifications. Many African languages, customs, and governance systems were erased or devalued, replaced with European models that often fail to serve local realities. The colonizers may have left, but the tools they used to divide Africa, tribalism, religious hierarchy, ethnic favoritism, artificial borders, still influence elections, governance, and social relations. The strategy of divide and rule was not a side effect of colonization. It was its core weapon. It allowed a small number of European colonizers to dominate a vast, complex, and culturally rich continent by turning communities against each other. By manufacturing identities, carving meaningless borders, favoring one group over another, and building deep distrust, colonizers ensured that Africa would remain broken even after they were gone. This legacy did not vanish with independence. The ethnic conflicts, civil wars, coups, and distrust we see across Africa today are not ancient tribal rivalries. They are the aftershocks of deliberate colonial engineering. Africa was not divided because it was primitive. It was divided because division was profitable. And until this history is acknowledged and understood, the scars will remain. But by learning and sharing this truth, we take a step toward reclaiming our past and reshaping the future, one rooted not in colonial lies, but in African unity, resilience, and dignity. If this story moved you, or if you learned something new today, don't let it stop here. Like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter from this eye-opening series. Share this with your friends, family, or anyone who believes the past no longer matters, because it does. We're here to tell the truth that textbooks left out. Thank you for watching. Let's keep uncovering history together.